No mai haere mai, my name is Jeremy and this is the Maxim Institute podcast. This year, our Sir John Graham lecture was due to be delivered by Associate Professor Tom Simpson. Titled Rebuilding Trust, Populists, Elitists and the Future of Our Democracy, Tom was joining us to speak from his over a decade of study on the idea of trust and how it sits at the core of issues of political polarisation that have challenged the foundations of democratic societies in recent years. Currently an Associate Professor of Philosophy and Public Policy at the Blattevinick School of Government at the University of Oxford, Tom studied at Cambridge University for his BA, his MPhil and PhD, and somehow, between degrees, he found the time to be an officer with the Royal Marines Commandos for 5 years. While COVID-19 has delayed Tom's visit to deliver the Sir John Graham lecture until 2021, we didn't want to miss the opportunity to speak about these ideas this year, as they've only become more relevant and pressing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that nations have responded to the extreme pressures of lockdown, emergency powers, and fighting an invisible threat. In this discussion, you'll also hear the voice of New Zealand academic Dr. Richard Ekins, who's Professor of Law and Constitutional Government at Oxford University and the head of the Judicial Power Project at Policy Exchange. Keen-eyed friends of Maxim Institute may actually recognise Richard's name, as he authored several papers for us as a research fellow while he was a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. Thomas and Richard are colleagues at Oxford, and also great friends, and I hope you'll enjoy sitting in for this conversation as much as I did when we recorded it. Unfortunately, I have to admit there is a slight technical issue with some of the audio which does affect the quality of some of what you'll hear. We've edited around this as much as possible, but we've left in what we need to in order to make sure that you can follow what's being said. Our apologies, we'll make sure it doesn't happen again. For now, enjoy the conversation and stick around afterwards to find out more details about how you can make sure you're there for Tom's Sir John Graham lecture next year in 2021. Tom, I thought we'd just start with you and just ask what may seem to be an obvious question, but I thought it's worth asking. Why is it that you picked the topic of trust to devote so much of your time and energy to? What is it about that sort of piqued your attention?
So I've been working on trust for a number of years and maybe even too long. I started thinking about it almost accidentally. And so this was in summer of 2007. I just left the military after 5 years. I'd been very interested in what's called epistemology, the theory of knowledge. And the history of Western philosophy thinks about knowledge in a very individualistic manner. So what is it that I can discover? And the paradigm for this is Descartes, who tries to work out knowledge from the foundations upwards. And that just seemed to me deeply discrepant with how life actually was, that we are constitutively dependent on others for what we know. So I started from there. That's as it were a philosopher's instinct. And as I came to think about it, it seemed to me that this dependence on others was just a far wider reaching phenomenon than just knowledge. And I started working in the summer of 2008 for a banker in the City of London who was interested in what moral questions might be raised by banking and whether there was any light that we could shed on this. And I was thinking about trust in relation to this. So, summer of 2008...
Yeah, at a pretty significant time for the banking industry.
Right. So I had no idea about this. Absolutely no idea. I started thinking about it in June, and I was then logging on. So in the UK, it's sometimes referred to as the nation's tannoy service, the Today programme on Radio 4. And I'd be listening to Radio 4, and I could hear the panic in their voices as we may not have a payment system by the afternoon. That was as the financial crisis was taking root, as Lehman Brothers went down, and there was this question of the dominoes that were going on. And it suddenly became very evident that this trust was a phenomenon that permeated our economic activity, permeated our scientific activity, which, as it were, that's where I'd come from. And with further reflection, it came to be clear that it permeates our political activity, our social activity. And it was really in retrospect that I saw that the military, in a way, crystallises a lot of these dilemmas of trust very dramatically, because soldiers ultimately put their lives on the line, and they do so relying on their colleagues to work with them for that. And there's very thick cultures of trust which are built up within military units precisely to enable that. And I suppose I became interested in what is the foundation of trust as a notion. That's a philosopher's question. And then what are the forms of social activity that this enables more widely?
I'll throw another philosopher's question at you, because I think I really like the idea that you start with, that it's an epistemological question, which is, how do we know? And so another philosopher's question, which I think that you will probably not like at all, and feel free to reframe. But what is trust? So we talk about it, and I mean, I think we can look at it. I can say, oh, I don't trust her, or I don't think he's very trustworthy, or I know him, I trust him. Or even I can trust that, when I go to the supermarket, there will be tomatoes. There are all these different kinds of trust. So maybe could you sort of position those different types of trust from what you've worked on, and maybe tell us a bit more about how those types of trust affect us by their presence or their lack in our communities and society.
Okay, great. So that is a philosopher's question, and I'm excited to address that. And I'll do so in as non-boring a way as possible. The idea of what trust is, there's something over and above simply relying on other people. And that's, in a way, that's where the discussion of trust gets going. That's where we try and think about what's going on. So what is going on? What is the difference between it? Well, there are at least 3 different approaches that you might take, each of which have their advantages and disadvantages. So one would be to see trust as fundamentally an emotional feeling. It's reliance plus some kind of emotional stance. So you might think that there's a kind of optimism about the other person. There's that the other person will come through. That there's maybe goodwill on both parts. The person who trusts another has goodwill towards that person.
I'm curious as to the difference between a sort of sense of reliability and a sense of trust. You can tell me if I'm going too far between different types of trust here. But like I said before, if I trust that there's going to be tomatoes at the supermarket, and I'm not worried about I don't have to go today, I can go tomorrow. Is that just reliability, or is that actually trust?
Good. So this brings us to the second way of thinking about trust, which is it would see it as a rational calculation of the likelihood of the other person coming through, or in your case, the likelihood of the tomatoes being there. And so on this view of trust, what really counts for making trust sensible or appropriate is that the other person is trustworthy. So you want to know that the other person is going to be trustworthy. If you've got evidence for that, then that will make trust appropriate. The mechanism for trust that's involved, or at least the mechanism for reliance that's involved, is one that may actually be concealed. So the con man is not fully disclosing what's going on to the victim, and you could have other forms of dependence which rely on that same kind of concealment. So if I lie, and it looks like you could have rational reliance, but which is based on a kind of manipulation of the other person, and those forms of manipulation are not going to be compatible with trust. And in fact, we can also see that it's not just manipulation or concealment. You could also have forms of dependence which are coercive. They rely on threats. So it might be that I'm going shopping. Other shoppers trust me not to inject the tomatoes with poison. Like, that'd be a really antisocial thing to do. Does the shop trust me to do that? Well, they might do, or they might put security guards there. And if they put security guards there, then it's not trust. So it looks like the mechanism about how trust works is it's something that everyone involved can acknowledge. It's open, it's public, it's non-coercive. And that really brings us on to the third way that you might think about trust, which I think is ultimately the way that I come down. And this is to see trust as fundamentally a kind of moral, that there's a kind of moral expectation which leads to the basis for reliance. So the paradigm for this would be a promise. I promise to have a chat with you, and you now expect it of me. I'm obliged to do this. And there's something about my giving my word. There's something about the reliance that you come to have on me because I've given my word that grounds this form of trust. And I think that's the fundamental, as it were, that's the heart of our trust practices. And that's not to say that every instance of trust always has this. There can be lots of many different kinds of trust. Trust can have different forms, different bases in different situations. But I think that's the most central and, in a way, the most socially important form of trust that we have.
Isn't that a bit inflated, though? So why not just think, it is your confidence that such and such will happen, or so that another person or agent or group is going to act in a certain way. And sometimes that's because of their moral character or something else. Other times it's just the incentive structure is ordered in the right sort of a way. Do you need to differentiate between those? It looks like you are. It's a moralized idea in a sense. It's the expectation about why the person who was trusted will act in a certain way.
Good. So it's going to be a question as to, there's going to be a spectrum of instances. So there's high intensity, as it were, interpersonal relationships. And then we're moving down into more forms of habit at other times. And there's going to be an alignment of incentives. But I think the moment we're headed into a purely incentive-based form of engagement, I think that's the point at which we step out of a trusted interaction. And so there's going to be very subtle instances where where incentives align and accompany some kind of moral expectation, but if they displace it, then it ceases to be trust. I think, on my view,
if the incentives are out of line, then that's going to place a big question mark over the trust relationship, isn't it? Even with maybe not in all relationships, but even when you've got other grounds for trust, if you know the incentives are running in the wrong direction, it's a cause for worry, at least.
Yeah, of course, it's going to be a concern. We've then got to think about the term incentives is quite a plastic one. We can use it in different ways. So the paradigm is money. I offer you some money, but we sometimes use it in a more general sense, just to mean like a reason that I have. So something that's kind of in the middle will be something like, I make a promise to you to do something, and there's no money riding on it, but you will think badly of me if I renege on it. Now, in what sense is you thinking badly of me? Is that an incentive? I mean, you might describe it like that. It's an extension of the term. It feels like that's going to be pretty central to a lot of instances of trust. And then at what point is you're thinking badly of me? Is that as it were, a cue for me to feel guilty? I suddenly realise that I ought to feel guilty. And the fact that is my feeling guilty, is that an incentive? I don't know. If I really want to kind of push the language, then I might use it in that way. But it seems to me that misdescribes the phenomena. Really what's going on is my moral self-awareness is kicking in at that point.
I want to sort of just bring it out from interpersonal and the personal, and kind of go into the second part of this question, which is, how does a lack of or the presence of trust, can you give us some sort of practical examples of how this plays out in societies that are high trust or low trust environments, and kind of why is it necessary? What is it in society that actually does rely on trust itself?
So we started off thinking about trust between individuals, between two people, and then we're wanting to think about, is there a generalised sense of trust that would characterise a society? And the starting point for that would be, just on average, if I meet someone, are they more likely to be trustworthy or not, just in very crude binary terms. And social scientists for many years now have been asking a question which in effect tries to capture this. So they say, in general, do you think most people can be trusted or not enough people can be trusted in your society? And then you get fluctuating levels according to this, and you can track it over time. The former Soviet bloc countries, for instance, tend to do very poorly on this. Quite a lot of Mediterranean, Southern European cultures will tend to do poorly. Northern European cultures, Scandinavia is always right at the top of the list. And Japan, interestingly, very high as well.
New Zealand's quite high on the list too.
Alarmingly, there's been gradual reductions across all countries in the proportion of people who say that, generally speaking, you can rely on trust. Now, why does this matter? So at the macro level, we can track through the economic impact, for instance, of trust. So one study finds that high levels of trust are worth about 2% of GDP. So in the aggregate, this makes a difference. Now, why does it make a difference? Well, you can start off at in economic terms by thinking about the difference that trust makes to what's called transaction costs. So if one company is transacting with another, an individual is transacting with another, how extensive a contract do you need? Or how much of the basis of the relationship can be done without a contract, done on the basis of a shared understanding and a willingness to be flexible with each other. And the lawyers do very well out of low trust because there's big contracts that need to be drawn up. And in a high trust context where there's established relationship, or both established relationship and the possibility of forming a relationship very quickly, you can just short-circuit non-productive economic activity and go straight to that. So that's a very clear example. Then you move into, as it were, softer examples. So one of the characteristics of most professional relationships is that the professional is acting on behalf of the person that they're advising. So this is true for doctors, it's true for lawyers, it's true for accountants, financial advisors. And most of these relationships have the possibility of incentive misalignment. So a contrast case would be the healthcare system in a private insurance-based context like the US versus a solely state-funded context, which is what the UK is much closer to. And in a marketised system, the doctor can make money out of advising patients to go through procedures which are not strictly in that individual's medical interest. And what the professional relationship does is it should say that even though I have these potential incentives not to advise you in what's in your best interest, nonetheless, the principle at stake is that I should be acting on your behalf and working for you. And so whenever you get these potential misalignments between what's in the best interest of the client and what's in the best interest of the practitioner, the professional, trust becomes of significant social importance at that point.
Yeah, no, I just want to question the point about the lawyers doing well out of a low trust environment, which is obviously partly true, but I wonder if the environment's low trust enough, the lawyers aren't going to be in business, aren't going to be able to play a role in a way. It does rely on a certain willingness to trust, and as you say, to trust the lawyers themselves, that they'll be bounded professionally by a certain kind of ethos. A lot of the contractual arrangements, I think, will rely partly on, we won't need to rely on these very often. They'll be a backstop, they'll frame things, etc. That the law is a compensating feature for a lack of trust is I think, certainly true, but it's a bolster and support for it must be true as well.
Can I just pick up on that? So one of the features is it looks like you never actually do away with trust. So at the end of or maybe in a more restrictive fashion, you're always relying on other people. So in the legal context, you can contract maybe a way of kind of displacing trust for the two people who are contracting. But what you simply do is you displace trust onto those who are enforcing the law. And so firstly, that's the legal practitioners, and actually ultimately it's the judges. So one of the striking things is if you have a transactional culture all the way down, suddenly you get questions like, can I buy the judge? And if I can buy the judge, we're in a really, really bad situation. The low trust societies tend to also be societies where corruption is a real challenge. And that those two things probably feed each other, that high levels of corruption mean low levels of trust. And also, because there's low levels of trust, there's low levels of a kind of thick normative framework which says that people are expected to behave in a particular way. That means that corruption is facilitated.
So low levels of trust outside of family, clan, or those with whom you have a shared immediate interest.
Yeah, great. We then need to begin to be more subtle and distinguish what are the potential bases for trust. And there can be particularistic bases for trust where you have some kind of in-group loyalty. And because you and I, are marked by the same in-group feature, that's a basis for trust. And the magic moment comes when that, as it were, is left behind and you have a universalistic basis for trust, that the shared moral culture that we're in is one that everyone is expected to be trustworthy because you're expected to be trustworthy. That's the reason for it, that you're expected to comply with your obligations. And so shifting from a particularistic basis for trust to a generalised basis for trust is how that happens. That's really where the money is, so to speak. That's the magic moment.
At the risk of asking you to be a historian, are there particular points in different cultural histories that you can point to as going, that was crucial for developing a culture of trust, a culture of high trust, or these kind of cultural roots? And Richard, I'm also interested in kind of different cultural ideas of justice as well, because I think that, pointing to the courts and the rule of law and those sorts of things, that, we've different case law and different kind of bases for law in different cultures. The sort of sense that people are generally trustworthy, and that if I go to, in New Zealand, if I go before a judge, I'm pretty sure, even if, that if he has a personal interest in the case, he'll recuse himself, that there will be a dispassionate application of these kind of higher levels or higher morals than just sort of personal loyalty, and kind of where that comes from.
Well, that's a tricky question. Obviously, not everywhere has it, and New Zealand's had the good fortune to partly inherit it and then partly hold on to it. And how did the English and the British get it? Well, it takes a while, and you've got a whole series of sort of contingent connections, I think, historical moments, but where people clearly valued the fact that that justice couldn't be bought, that they could rely on one another to enforce rules against each other. They were willing to take seriously the failure to do so, and enough people caring about carrying that forward, which I think is crucial. I mean, obviously, this is a natural instinct to take fairness seriously, I think, but whether it gets maintained and built up into something larger, that takes some time. So, I mean, you can go a long way back, think about the significance. I mean, whether juries are a great idea as a sort of way of finding the facts in criminal trials, they clearly involve us jointly in our decision making, and the fact that you can rely on your fellow citizens to give you justice or to be a restraint on a tyrannical state, that helps contribute to an idea that we're sort of all in it together. And then if you start to sort of distinguish yourself as being committed to this way of doing things, then you might take it more seriously, even if, of course, you hope every other community also will start to care as well.
Certainly in the UK, we've got the common law tradition, and that's represented around the world. And it also seems like most tribal, village-based forms of organisation will also have situations where people gather together to conduct a case and sort of work out what the rights and wrongs of a particular situation are. What marks the divergence between the common law tradition as we have it versus just simply small-scale tribal gathering? Yeah.
Well, I mean, the common law begins, time out of memory, with Henry II setting out his judges. And that the fact that England has one of the oldest continuous monarchies and had, frankly, a very strong monarchy compared to other sort of neighbouring European states is pretty significant. So it's an instrument of royal justice. It's a way of building up the power and authority of the king to present yourself as willing to give justice to all comers. And it's a common law because the king's justice is applied across the whole place. It's not just particular to our particular custom here and there. And so, I mean, the big worry that you should have, and that people do have, with sort of just the village gathering together and giving justice is obviously that it's very easy for that to become particular or biased or score settling or inefficient as well. And so that there is an authority above that's standing behind. So why do you take seriously the king's judges when they arrive? Well, because they're backed by the authority of the king. And the king has a certain self-understanding of his role in relation to the duty to give justice, that he's answerable to God, that it's a certain image of a Christian king, etc. I mean, obviously it's sometimes and often observed in the breach, but the image matters, and it's an image that both is morally attractive, but also that if you play your part in it, you do your bit to build up the monarchy and to build up the sort of the capacity of the realm to live peacefully together. So it does begin with a higher authority in a way, but then one that gets received as being, well, this is doing a valuable thing. We shouldn't resist this in the same way we might resist some other kind of. It's not just tax collectors showing up, although they show up too, but it's justice arriving. And
that rule of law connection is fascinating because, in a way, that's the story about how the rule of law emerges. So, Jeremy, just going back to your question, it's harder to put your finger on when cultures of high trust emerge, precisely because they take so long to grow. It's a deeply organic process, but it's easier to put the finger on when trust is lost. And so actually, Eastern Europe is a important case study in that, because the trauma of Soviet times and the kind of surveillance state, police state, had a deeply trust-shattering effect, and those countries are really have been really struggling to emerge out of that. There's another body of literature which was the social capital literature from the 1990s. So Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone is often seen as foundational for this. And Putnam's analogy is he goes to the 10-pin bowling alley and he just sees a lot of people bowling alone, whereas 20 or 30 years previously they might have been bowling in clubs. And it was the withering of forms of civil association that he was really concerned about. I think it's a deep insight, that. And then the question is, what is the role that these civil associations play? And I think there's three distinct roles that they can do. So one is, in practical terms of politics, they are a source of power that can resist the state. So the the state, conventionally understood as this very significant form of power, can impose itself, and individuals are not able to resist it. So individuals need to be able to organise, to join together in order to hold the state to account. And civil associations provide the means by which that happens. They provide the means for voice. They provide the, as it were, the habits for people to join together in order to provide countervailing power to the state. In practical terms, if the state has no form of resistance, it's going to become abusive and overextend its power. So I think the other two really important respects in which civil society institutions, both of the informal kind and the formal kind that you're talking about, matter. So one is some of them hold up moral ideals. So religious institutions are particularly in the business of holding up moral ideals, but it's not only religious institutions. Other charities, other forms of association may hold up a set of these are the way we think. This is the way that we think about the world, and it's the we, and it's the story about who we are, where we've come from, and what we think right conduct looks like. And then the second thing that they do is they form people. So they're processes of education and of character formation, and they provide a context in which you can get things wrong and you can be corrected in the context of hopefully a nurturing, compassionate environment. And you've got models to aspire to, and you can take your place in then handing on the culture that's transmitted. So I think one of the really dangerous or sort of challenging situations that we're in now is a general sense that these mediating institutions, as Peter Berger and Richard Newhouse called it, these mediating institutions are under real pressure, and that will have a long-term effect on political health and the prospects of a high-trust society.
There is a traditional role for the state and the sort of highest level of authority in protecting individuals against intermediary associations as well. So it's sort of a two-way process there. The protection, or the rightful claim on the part of a king is I'll protect the ordinary people from their feudal overlords, from the barons. And maybe now the equivalent is state purports to protect us against sort of abusive companies or someone. And getting that balance right is really quite tricky. And it's part of the appeal that the state makes to authority and trust, I think.
In one of your writings, Tom, you say that the central thought I am pursuing is that moral commitment is one of the central bases for rational trust. Shared moral norms really are the glue that holds society together. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in Western postmodern society, it seems almost ludicrous to suggest that society kind of must group around a shared moral norm. We've lost common faith, common religion, and in many ways a common sense of being able to even say this is what is right or wrong, in a moral context at least. Although I think that there's been, in recent times, there's been sort of a resurgence of a new moral language. But in a postmodern sensibility of personal kind of truth and personal belief that isn't necessarily shared across these kinds of thriving civil associations or institutions, does it mean that we're doomed, that we just can't build trust if we don't have those?
That is a big question.
The question, to be clear, is: are we all doomed?
Richard, what do you think?
Well, I think you touched on this partly, Jeremy, but reports of the death of right and wrong may be overblown, and I don't just mean because there seems to be plenty of moralising going on in our present world. Some of it good, some of it bad. And I think actually there still is a lot of shared moral understanding and commitment, even if it doesn't often go by that name. It's premature to declare the victory of postmodernism. A great many of the things we do together, quite rightly, are anchored in true moral insights and commitments. And people might get embarrassed if they get called moral insights and commitments, but that's really what they are. They're a conviction that you don't treat people this way, or this is the right way to act in this sort of state. And the fact that we don't have as solid a grasp of moral language and insight as one should is a problem, I think. And I think there's sort of a decaying aspect to this, although never assume things can't be renewed and restored, of course. Yeah, society is in trouble if the engines that sort of fuel mix the metaphor badly, is the grounds of shared commitment and sort of shared moral understanding run out. But you can go a while without being quite clear on what the grounds are, I think, even if at some point you will run into trouble.
Obviously, I fundamentally agree with everything you said, Richard. I mean, so what's the phrase? Nature abhors a vacuum, and I think humanity, we abhor, as it were, a moral vacuum. And we have had this, actually, just my own biography, came of age in the 90s, early noughties. I think historians will look back and see this as a profoundly weird time when we kind of got on with consumption. We were in a sort of post-religious, pre-political or post-political moment, sort of, Tony Blair was triangulating here in the UK, bit of this, bit of that, and that was the kind of zeitgeist elsewhere. And I think the attempt to have a public square which doesn't have a clear moral basis is clearly being rejected right now. Political polarisation is really a reflection of two competing conceptions of what the moral basis for that public square should be, I think. I mean, what's our future? So one future is we have ongoing. I mean, I'm very concerned by political polarisation. I think we're in an extremely dangerous situation, and there is a possible equilibrium of internecine conflict for some period of time, just because the human instincts that political polarisation draws on, are very deep human instincts, and both the right and the left represent, as it were, enduring features of humanity. Success previously has depended in part on a substrata of agreement which crosses that. And I think one of the challenges for people of goodwill, in particular across the political spectrum, is to really focus on rebuilding that substrata of agreement, and then finding ways to disagree well at points of controversy. How that works, that's a harder question.
I even look at the phrase you used, the public square. It strikes me that in previous iterations of society and previous generations, place was a far greater definer of our identity. There's even ideas of national religion, or fighting for your country, or delineations of sort of city, town, state, nation. It seems that now our identities are much more shaped in an online social context, especially in our teenage years, meaning that the shared morals or the beliefs that you develop in that sort of key developing stage have a much greater opportunity to be sort of refined by people who have no connection to you in a physical sense, no geographic connection to you, but you can find this sort of very key identity forming and loyalty forming sense of community, sort of diaspora all around the world. What's that interplay between identity and where you sort of draw your loyalty from or to, where you sort of call your loyalty back to, and who you can have that shared basis of trust with?
I mean, who you share your life with clearly matters. A sort of political community is reliant on sharing your lives with one another sufficiently to think you've got a common good and that it's worth protecting, and that you can rely on one another, on your fellow citizens to play their part, and that you want to, and you're not just going to pursue entirely sort of atrophied individual, or it's not atrophied, is it? Because there still is a community here. It's just sort of played out across the internet and around the world. And I think that can coexist, that sort of identity elsewhere, or partial identity elsewhere, with a pretty robust groundedness in a place and sort of a community with a history. But they could come apart, and maybe that's what we've been seeing. Although I think possibly place is having a comeback. Our present time is not one of free travel and open borders just now.
Well, I think even in just the Brexit debate, I think you saw a battle between a global, or at least a European identity of this sort of technocratic, this is the right way of living for the future, versus a real backlash of place sovereignty. Or at least that's my sort of New Zealand eyes looking over the other side of the world, and I'm perfectly happy to be corrected on that.
No, I think you saw something that was there. There's a great book, which I'm going to mangle the title of, Somewheres versus Anywheres, I think.
The Road to Somewhere. David Goodhart.
The Road to Somewhere, thank you.
Yeah.
I should apologise to David for getting his book. The difference between the type of person who is relatively more defined and grounded in a particular location and community, and those who have, in a sense, more open horizons and can move more readily between global centres of education and capital and so on. And obviously this is a pretty pretty broad distinction, but there is something to it.
There's a weirdness, there's a paradox there in that the psychological instinct towards somewhere versus anywhere, which I think Goodhart's really put his finger on something very significant there as a kind of orientation towards the world. But the distinction between somewheres and anywheres is, as it were, something you could find in most societies. And highly international institutions, such as elite universities, have a habit of drawing people from across the world, which is great. And it also tends to be quite a unique, self-selected group of people who come from across the world, which tend to be those with anywhere broadly cosmopolitan kind of senses of themselves and identities. And in a way, one of the challenges is to find societies which are able to hold together the kind of the instinctive desires both of the somewheres and of the anywheres. So there is going to be international fluidity of some kind. Clearly we can't go to autarky if that ever existed, and there's going to be international cross-fertilisation, and that's clearly, there's tremendous upsides that come with that. And at the same time, we need to find a stable settlement where, as it were, the somewheres, large blocks of the population who feel a rooted sense of belonging, feel comfortable and feel like they've got a sense of continuity and inheritance, and their place in the world is respected. So one of the extraordinary figures from David Goodhart's book is that I think 60% of Brits live within 14 miles of where they grew up. That's a huge proportion. So that really speaks to something quite profound about your kind of way, and locality and place matters. One of the complexities is that we now live in an Anglophone world, which this conversation represents. So the English language, the internet flattens international boundaries where language is shared, and the English language is shared internationally, and particularly in UK, US, New Zealand, Australia. But where language is not shared, you get very discrete discourses emerging. And so I think I think our particular place, as in part of the Anglophone world, we can oversee the commonalities that are emerging. So in a way, I think the world is actually on divergent paths right now. So I think the Anglophone world is engulfed in highly polarised culture war, and place has become itself part of the points of conflict within that. What's your attitude towards the history of your place? Is it fundamentally one of condemnation or fundamentally one of approval? That's a distinct, and obviously the reality is somewhere in the middle. There are bad things and there are good things, but that instinct is one of the points of tension. But place at its best holds out the prospect of a basis of solidarity which crosses other social cleavages.
Can you tell us what the rest of the world's trajectory is? You've dealt with the Anglophone world.
Combination of national identity, reassertion of national heritage, and probably pragmatic sort of power, realpolitik, if I can put it that way. That would be my sense. And a lot of it's actually, and this is conscious on the part of some, it's in reaction to turmoil in the West.
The history of the West is partly a history of universalism and particularism. Maybe that's the history of the world, but I think the West in particular, because of the significance of Christianity, where the collapse of Rome is the end of a sort of universalistic political project, and the need to build up slowly and painstakingly particular ones. It matters that there's a kingdom in England because people can live better if there is. Otherwise, they're exposed to all sorts of tyranny and incursion and so on. And that there isn't a kingdom in France for a while is a moral tragedy. You've got to build one up. It's a serious civilizational prospect. But, there's a shared church, and no one can really, for a moment, hold out the idea there isn't a really serious universal project underway. So that tension, it's not tension, it's just there's more than one good thing in the world, and that forms us.
So clearly there's this tension between the universalistic and the particular. How do we hold these together? Augustine's framework, I think, is really helpful here. So one of Augustine's thoughts is that we have an order of loves. What's the order of our loves? There are different forms of attachment, forms of love that we have. We have civic loves, so those for the people we live amongst, for the communities that we're part of. We have familial loves, those that we commit our lives to as parents, children we bring up, and the extended family as well. And then we have love to God, divine love. And the order of love, I don't know if Augustine does this, so Simpson does this. So the order of love would be divine love first, familial love, and then civic love. And I think when you get the order of loves wrong, so in Augustine's terminology, you then get idolatry. That's when things really, when when the wheels come off. And so the idolatry of the nation that's a continual danger and a threat that we face, and that has clearly very pathological expressions. And so you need something else to kind of hold that civic love to account on the basis of.
If you think seriously about the goods that are in play and how other people can secure them and advance them, there's pretty robust common good that just can't be secured without some kind of all-encompassing. All-encompassing is too strong, maybe not. Complete community is Aristotle's line, and it gets you a long way. You need a state, and you need a pretty robust shared form of life therein. But obviously, states are not one single state, and they've got to engage with one another in collective projects to some extent, even if those are just the maintenance of peace, but probably much more robust than that. So there's a good above and beyond, but the trick is trying to advance that without abandoning the things further down. And I think that's the real challenge, to hold on to more than one good and to see the conditions under which they can be secured and not neglect them.
We've done a lot of talking around kings and kingdoms, but we live in a democracy, and representative democracy at that. The thing is, every time you look at a survey of the most trusted and least trusted positions, politicians definitely rank right down there along with telemarketers. It's fascinating to me that these are the people who we actually have to we vest our trust in them to represent us. What do you make of the fact that we constantly say we don't trust our politicians? And is that okay?
I want to say I don't trust the surveys. And I don't mean that I don't think people don't trust politicians. I think they often have widespread contempt for them. But their practice doesn't always suggest that. I mean, our practice as ordinary people, citizens. Because I think, New Zealand is true, even more so than England. Most people vote. Most people are willing to fall in line with the decisions made by Parliament. I think most people would be surprised and horrified if they found out that their politicians were taking bribes and acting in the really, truly venal way that they may sort of assert they do when they're all in it for themselves. There is an expectation that the politicians will, and I think a grounded expectation. Most of our politicians are not corrupt. They do have sincere commitment to public service. They are making the decisions the best they can. So I think, there's an overstatement on the part of people when they say they just don't trust them. That said, we both New Zealand and the UK have a very aggressive attack media, which is great in some respects and terrible in others, I think. It's designed to find and expose hypocrisy and criticise inconsistencies and so on. And so we force politicians into a certain kind of a dance in which they are willing participants, which I think does spur a kind of cynicism and lack of trust in at least some sort of a way. They just don't say what they mean, etc. But if they said what they mean, you crucify them and they'd suffer politically, etc., etc. We've built up an unhealthy sort of relationship. And then it's competitive, and we're all prone to believe the worst of our enemies to some extent, or those with whom we disagree. But still, you say all that. Nonetheless, New Zealand and the UK, we don't look at, mostly, those with whom we disagree politically as enemies. It's not an existential crisis if the other side wins an election. They're not going to round you up and put you up against a wall, etc. That said, does it matter? I think, yes, it does, actually. This is a kind of corrosive attitude that does rob institutions of what they have to offer. And by all means, you should be slow to accept any assurance made by a politician. But the sort of attitude that is deeply cynical and contemptuous of them, I think, is unjustified and pretty destructive. Back in, was it just over 4 years ago, a member of Parliament in Britain was murdered by a nasty man. And there was a brief and sort of quite welcome outpouring of public love for their MPs, actually, recognition that these are people who are working pretty hard and get a lot of things wrong, but that are doing a very, very valuable role. And the brief period was sort of recognising the breadth of work that was being done and the damage that sort of a thoroughgoing cynicism and hostility can wreak.
But I think both of you have alluded to the polarization of politics that we've seen, and that we've also seen, particularly in America, I think, with Congress, but I think to a lesser extent both in New Zealand and the UK, a real gridlock in terms of it seems that our parliaments often are not able to, for whatever reason, make truly meaningful change in many areas of sort of our political discussion, that the same conversations over and over again. And in the mix and in the gaps, we start seeing, and particularly in the US, this has long been the case, but in the New Zealand and the UK, there have been some significant examples recently of the courts stepping in and kind of trying to see if they might be able to make the change if our representatives aren't willing to. Richard, I know that you have some particular thoughts on this, and I thought that just in the context of, basically who do we trust, and if we're seeking justice, if we want there to be a right and wrong that we know that we can seek as people, why not the courts?
Well, courts are great for a number of things, but they have limitations, which the best judges entirely recognise and insist upon. So, a trial is a sort of artificial world. It's got a bounded task determining if such and such happened and what the law is to apply to it. And courts and judges are very good at keeping us to our commitments in one way. So that's, in one sense, what the law is. We made a decision in the past, or you made a decision in contracting or whatever else it might be, and we are going to take that now as the basis for what happens. Not going to abandon it because it's no longer convenient or whatever else it may be. But I think the temptation, which you do see around the world, it's characterized the United States for a long time, is to take that capacity that courts have to do justice in a particular framework. It's an indispensable capacity, and just to try and blow that up to a responsibility for the justice of the law itself. So courts and judges are good at the justice of applying the law faithfully and fearlessly without favour to the parties. That provides no capacity whatsoever to decide whether the law itself is in the right shape or not, or what it should be. And that requires judgment, choice, responsibility. It requires reasoning about right and wrong and justice and rights. But it involves choice, actually. It involves making a decision and taking responsibility for it, which politicians do, actually. We have a process for holding them to account and criticising them for their failures in this respect. I think the problem, in a way, is we've, going back to part of our earlier conversation, much of the shared language, which maybe we did have in earlier times with various problems, has slipped away. And the language of rights and human rights, in one sense, has filled part of the void. And human rights are precious and important, but the language of rights does a bit too much work in our moral discussion, I think. And relatedly, there's a sort of confusion, because human rights get some recognition in law, and there's sort of an assumption and sometimes expressly, that judges will be better at knowing what our rights are, what our human rights are. And judges, as I say, are pretty good at holding us to our legal rights when they've been established and laid down. Not so good at making the sort of open-ended decisions about what our rights are where we disagree. So should there be a right to assist someone else in suicide or be assisted? A judge has no insight into that question greater than any other human being, as, again, the best judges realise, I think, and recognise. So it's the fact you trust the judge not to take a bribe in deciding your dispute, or you trust the judge to fearlessly hold the law, even when it's inconvenient and a mob has gathered outside the courtroom, which should have that trust, and judges should live up to it. Doesn't follow they're the right ones to be making the choices about the kind of community we should be, or what justice requires in this contested sort of field of human activity.
So I absolutely share the analysis of, as it were, the division of labour between what the courts should be doing and what the legislature should be doing. And I think, Jeremy, just going back to your point, so Britain has experienced legislative deadlock for about 3 years, but that logjam has just cleared as of December with a very decisive victory for the Conservative government. And I think the trauma of the national debate around Brexit has been so intense in part because of the logjam, which was given really by two quite finely balanced electoral outcomes in 2015 and 2017. But I think that's out of keeping with the Westminster history and sort of pattern. And I think looking forward, we'd expect to see governments with the ability to govern. In America, it seems the logjam might be more structural. One of the things that political polarisation does is it makes it very difficult to achieve cross-party consensus. When any one of the three branches, Senate, House of Representatives or President, are not aligned, if they're not all in the same party, then you have to build cross-partisan consensus to get any legislation through in that context. So I don't know whether the activism, certainly what critics would regard as activism on the part of the Supreme Court in the US, is in part a reflection on and a response to the failure of the normal legislative process. Could you just talk to that, Richard? I don't know if that's there.
It partly fuels it, unfortunately. Both driven and sharpened up by the polarisation, but it's also partly a driver of it. So I think there's no way in the world President Trump would be president but for the feature of the significance of the president's role in appointing judges. A great many conservative voters who, frankly, despise Trump voted for him because they thought, well, someone's got to choose the next lot of judges or the next judge or two, and it absolutely can't be Hillary Clinton. So Trump will do a better job on that question probably, and everything else is secondary.
And we should hold our nose while voting for him. I mean,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
was the calculation in 2016 for many Conservative voters.
Yeah, no, for millions of voters, I'm sure, which is a real distorting feature of their polity. So there is a self-reinforcing thing, which is, look, the political authorities can't make decisions, so we have to. The problem is when the court makes a decision in these hot-button questions, a number of them, it makes them in a way that no one else can be involved in. It's the marginal judge, so it's not even all of the judges. Most of their votes are assured. It's the one or two in the middle, or the one, the next one to be appointed. And this is sort of a generational victory or defeat, or maybe even is the presented as permanent. You lose the Supreme Court case, and that's it. No recourse, no comeback. I mean, nominally you could amend the Constitution, but that's impossible. So I mean, it certainly drives. It makes the fight for presidential elections vastly more consequential, or seemingly so, than they were in the American past. If you don't secure victory in the Supreme Court, you're in one sense socially damned. They speak about Supreme Court judgments as sort of sanctifying an outcome, which I find just bewildering talk, really. Here's a really serious moral or political controversy and needs a decision, and by all means we should argue about it and make a decision. But the thought that the right way to do that is by sort of securing a presidential victory 8 years ago, such that your man or woman is on the court and can make the right call, I think is just very, very odd. The way same-sex marriage was legalised in various different countries. So Britain and New Zealand, parliamentary discussion, decision, some free votes, etc. I mean, Ireland, public referendum. The United States, litigation. And I think the legacy of that partly, maybe not with same-sex marriage, probably to some extent, definitely with abortion, the legacy is an intensification of political polarisation. The room for compromise is gone. The sort of sense that we have to come to some settlement together that we can live with, and that we can contest later because nothing is settled in politics and we can always fight it out later. That's just I would say absent from America. That's too strong, but it's certainly muted, largely absent, and it's not a good way to be governed.
Obviously, we should have been having you, Tom, come and speak with us in person, but what has got in the way of that is the COVID-19 pandemic. It was interesting seeing the response to that. And this whole pandemic has performed a kind of stress test on our trust in institutions and kind of the reserves of our goodwill in society. So I'm interested in your thoughts as someone who's been thinking about trust for quite a while, that almost this has been an experiment for seeing how trust works within society when it's really tested. I'm interested in your thoughts on what you've seen.
I think the simple point is that we have seen the reservoirs of trust in government displayed, that these extraordinary changes to our lives have been just adopted by population, certainly in the UK, which is the context I know, very quickly and easily. People have just shifted to that. And it's not that the police have had to do no work enforcing it, but they've had to do relatively little proportional to the demands, the expectations that were laid down. I think we've come out, so the initial period was definitely one where politics was put on the back burner. There was a sense we all pulled together. There was a rally around the flag effect in the polls where support for the Prime Minister and government went up. Politics has returned in relation to responses to the coronavirus, which I think is a matter of real regret and is actually illustrative of the challenges in the public environment now. So there's now an identifiable left-leaning progressive position on the lockdown and a right-leaning position, etc. So I think the appeal to experts actually goes not nearly as far as you might hope and and think. The legacy is going to be twofold. So one element of the legacy will be just when we do the debrief, as it were, after the coronavirus has passed. Who knows when that will be? It might still be another year's time. When that debrief happens, how well did our institutions cope? And I think the answer will be not nearly as well as we hoped that they would. I don't know whether that will be shattering myself. I think there'll be lessons learned and hopefully the government will become more adaptive. And I think one of the principal lessons there will be, can we implement more vigorous debate between experts and incorporate that into the policy-making process? So rather than have a committee of experts who are tasked to come up with consensus, which in practice means that the chair exercises disproportionate influence, in part by selecting who's on the committee. That seems to me a bad way in general of making decisions. What we're trying to institutionalise is disagreement amongst experts and then some kind of mode of evaluating the disagreement. So in the UK, we've had very different epidemiological advice from London-based teams and Oxford-based teams. And it just happens that the London-based teams are the ones who had the ear of government at the start. But we need that diversity of viewpoint in the decision-making process.
No, I mean, I think it was understandable that the experts were, the chief medical officers were flanking the prime ministers in the early stages. And there's sort of a sensible demonstration. We take technical expertise seriously and that we're not flying by night and so on. That said, there was a risk which became more obvious here, I think, over time, but here being the UK. Technical expertise is not a substitute for political responsibility and judgment, and there are some matters on which technical expertise can only take you so far. The diversity amongst technical experts is highly significant and became more obvious as time went by. It became more obvious to the politicians and to the public. I imagine the experts in question knew it all along, but the risk, relatedly, that technical expertise will be leveraged into political authority is a real one. And so making such use of the multiplicity of experts as you can is obviously vital without letting that expertise be played out into fields and areas to which it has no proper play.
Part of the complexity is, so, obviously Richard and I sit in the university. We are kind of experts in our field and surrounded by, we work with experts. That's the kind of field we work in. And there's a difficulty because some academics, many academics, want nothing to do with the politics. They just want to do what they're good at, and they want to offer that on as completely objective and impartial a basis as possible and feed it into the policy-making process so that politicians can then can work out what the moral political trade-offs are, explain the reason for that, and then take ownership of that. And that's completely right and proper. And so we've definitely seen academics feeling a bit burnt by the sense that the halo, as it were, was kind of being abused so that politicians didn't have to take responsibility for decisions which are properly political decisions. So that's one group of academics, and I suspect that's the majority. I think that's true of most academics. There are also other academics who are highly politically engaged, and the danger is that the borderline between expert advice and political questions becomes quite blurry in those contexts. From the political perspective, it's very difficult to work out who's who, which is which. That makes a genuinely complicated situation, and that also feeds into public discussion. I think public are becoming aware that there's diverse levels of political engagement on the part of academics. I think we're in for some fragile, febrile times. So most, the populist moment, so-called, which 2016 might have inaugurated, and which has been a feature of certainly European and American politics in recent years. I think there's quite a clear line between, a number of factors, but the financial crisis of 2008 was a significant contributing factor to that, and a sense that the social, that wasn't the only one, there's others as well, but a combination of factors meant there was a sense that the social contract in some sense had been broken. And I think it's highly likely that some of those trends are going to be re-exacerbated by the current crisis.
But obviously the elites of higher learning have an outsized role in guiding or suggesting a set of moral ideas that could bind us together. As two people who are within that kind of institution, who maybe have taken some less than popular stands, how do you think that trust in academia is going? And do you think that there is a threat to that sort of trustworthiness of the institution as one that can actually be trusted to really wrestle with these ideas?
So yes, I think there is a problem. I mean, it varies by field, and as Tom said before, in one sense, most academics on most subjects maybe just doing their level best to find truth in the corner in which they're engaged. But I think you've got a problem of groupthink on many subjects, actually, including sometimes on the substance of the academic endeavour rather than just on controversies that wash over. The UK Academy, I think we were ground zero for the subset of the community that was deeply opposed to Brexit. I think 90% of academics, possibly, I'm making the figure up, but I think it was something like that, reported figures, voted to remain, which obviously is just a series of perfectly defensible and plausible political choices on the part of individuals. But if it ends up being the case, as it almost was for a while, that this major part of society, the academy, defines itself partly by sharing one side of a political controversy, that's challenging, and you see that in the States, and as well, as you sort of alluded to. And if you end up with part of the community viewing the academy as the enemy, the political enemy, then that's disastrous for the academy. It's disastrous for popular participation in higher education in all sorts of ways. It's disastrous, frankly, for public funding of universities. The worry you could have is that if the academy if it's sort of a two-way antipathy, so we, ordinary members of a community, look at the academy as though they have nothing but disdain for them, and, well, you return like for like, and, nothing wrong with having an intellectual elite. I think it's sort of inevitable. But ideally, you have an intellectual elite that was committed to the good of those with whom they shared a place and a sort of a political life. And it was committed to engaging them respectfully and so on, and then vice versa. And that there is, or at least has been, in some peril. Possibly the whole COVID experience will beat it back to some extent. Because obviously there's a great deal of public hope and confidence in scientists here and there and coming up with technical solutions with some reason.
In broad brush terms, the natural sciences are, because they've got such a secure methodology, they're just going to get on with doing natural science. The social sciences and humanities are it's more significant when there's a very significant proportion of academics who share quite a distinctive way of looking at the world, which is dissonant with how the public view that. So the Brexit debate was really where this became very evident for me, and I'd come out as voting Leave. The issue is, I think, not in itself that you might get a significant majority of academics who make the individual judgment which happens to go in a particular direction. There's all sorts of completely benign explanations for that, and Leave and Remain, they're both reasonable people who went both sides, and there's a proper debate to be had on it. I think the issue arises when, because there is an overwhelming preponderance of people who view something, take one side, and you then get permission to disparage and pathologise the alternative viewpoint. And if you're just not exposed to actual people who think the contrary, then that becomes a very easy thing to do. And in a context of political polarisation, the speed with which people move into that becomes quicker and quicker. And then suddenly you get the academy. It becomes to look like there is the academy rather than an institution which hosts a plurality of voices. That becomes a kind of sense of a consensus, and it becomes an engaged consensus. It becomes a participant in whatever the political controversy is, and I think that's a very, very dangerous position to be in. And I think there is an increasing awareness of that in the public, and the academy will lose political legitimacy over time if that carries on. So I think a proper concern for the health of the academy would see really clear attempts to promote viewpoint diversity, genuine permission for people to think across the whole spectrum of political views.
I had a question actually for Tom arising out of what we began with, actually, I suppose, with the general financial crisis and the bankers in 2007. And that was a crisis of a lack of trust in one way, of course. So financial institutions are starting to tumble, and there's effectively, to simplify enormously, a great big bank run underway. But partly it's a crisis because the trust that we had was not warranted. So we collectively let various arrangements run, and investors were insufficiently sceptical and so on. And suddenly, the excess of trust, is exposed. And then that ripples into a lack of trust, but then with some reason. How does one handle that dialectic, I suppose, or is it just overreaction in these contexts is to be expected?
So it's very easy to talk about trust and what a great thing it is, and if we don't also have trustworthiness, then the rails come off very quickly. In a way, that's the thread that the needle that I'm trying to thread in my work on trust, that it's holding together the moral dimension, the moral expectation that's involved in trust, the reliance on moral character or the kind of culture, with a rational expectation, a grounded expectation that people will be trustworthy. So if you don't have that grounded expectation, then there's a bunch of times when you should not be trusting. There's a tricky task to work out when your trust should be in effect based on evidence and when you might want to have supererogatory trust So supererogatory trust would be something like, think of that episode in Les Miserables where Bishop Myriel says to Jean Valjean, "And you forgot the candlesticks." And he gives him the candlesticks, not because he has any reason to think that Valjean will not squander this and go and live a dissolute life and end up back in the Rex in prison, but as a supererogatory act, a kind of demonstration of trust, give him the opportunity to put his life back on lock, rebuild his life. And he takes that. So that's supererogatory trust. It's going beyond any evidence that you have. And we want to say there's moments of moral heroism there, and yet the normal running trust needs to be undergirded by trustworthiness, and the banking crisis illustrates that. And I suppose I see that as a broader challenge that we face between we've learnt the power of incentives to structure our communal lives and to change behaviour, and many good things have come out of that. And when you repeatedly assume that as your framework and your basis for modifying behaviour, you end up with a situation where you erode the moral climate, the moral culture, the expectations of moral character, which are actually needed to undergird the whole thing. And so the danger of erosion of, as it were, the moral capital of a society, that is one of the hinge moments that I think we might be at. And and the debate around free trade, international trade, is in effect a version of that. So to what extent do we need to reshore supply chains? Do we need to accept economic inefficiencies for the sake of rebuilding other things which matter, and actually in the long run matter for economic efficiency?
The other big one that's come up recently is the idea that there are institutions and parts of society that many of us had sort of unquestioningly trusted. And then with the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests, we've seen that there are whole swathes of society where people have a very different experience of those institutions. And suddenly, there's a sense of what that does to our trust in the police. But basically just in all of these different, in the core or the character of the institutions that we thought we knew. As people are sort of agitating for change and a revisiting of the core or the character of those institutions, how is it possible, and this is related to what Richard was kind of asking, how is it possible for an institution to remake itself, or does it have to have sort of an outside force come in to make sure that it has changed in order for us to be able to trust in it properly again?
I don't think it has to be the latter. So I think institutions can rebuild themselves from within, and if the people who make up the institutions and the sort of leadership within them is committed to change, then they can change. It may often be very helpful or necessary in some contexts for an external stimulus from higher authority, or from, with the example of police, just from those whom you're policing. So policing, certainly in the sort of Anglo-New Zealand tradition, is policing by consent, and you need the support of those over whom you're exercising authority. And the same is true for law more generally, actually. So if you've got a problem with part of your community or the whole of it over time, where they are going to look at you as not having their best interests at heart, then that's a major, it's an operational problem, partly, but it's sort of a structural problem. The United States has a somewhat different model of policing. I think it's more, and maybe that's part of the problem, it's going to be increasingly analogous to the military in various ways. I think much American policing must still be non-violent and non-coercive. Knowing how you're seen and then working to change how you're seen so that people can repose trust in you, I think is that's the challenge. But then it's sort of vital. I think the part of the worry you would have is that if the institution is undermined by a sort of erosion of trust in it more generally, or further undermined, then you're not going to get it doing the job it needs to do. You just can't do without a police force. Maybe it doesn't have to be a quasi-military one. Maybe that's a disastrous thing. But the challenge is to rebuild the institution, not to rip it down. And that's the worry. It's the challenge that protest movements often have, I think. How to effect change without being excessive.
And how to be constructive, because ultimately you have to be able to build what you believe is good, not just point to what is bad.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, I think that probably in the United States, that is the hope that is being made, that you will end up with a police force.
And also a diversion of the responsibilities, which is what a lot of the protesters are talking about, and actually building up other institutions like social work and other ways of dealing to or meeting the needs of the community.
Oh, sure, you might over-rely on your police force. I think maybe they do, to think law enforcement is some sort of all-encompassing social institution, and probably it is a strategic one. It's sort of nested within a whole lot of other relationships. But it certainly can't compensate for, or it's going to be distorted if it tries to compensate for all the other various arrangements that should be in place.
And I think there's a real challenge here for leadership in these institutions, because, as you point out, Jeremy, the danger is that there are constituencies, groups of people who have felt excluded by institutions, and that the invitation to trust has not been extended to them, or that's been one that's made no sense to them. And so I think there's, right now, we're at a kind of listening moment, and to try and work out what are the points of what are those constituencies who have certainly not trusted and have felt excluded. And in the UK context, racial and ethnic minorities, there's a listening moment there to work out sort of how we go forward, how we build trust if in places if it was never there in the first place. That's a real challenge for leaders who've come in through an institution, and they've maybe come in and, as it were, this has been the way things have done, and we just haven't had to pay attention to these voices before. And now there's a clear awareness that that's absolutely necessary and right and proper to do so. And so reconfiguring the institution to ensure that those voices are not just listened, but they're participating in that institution is a real challenge.
Just to finish off, I thought just bringing it back to the very personal from the societal. Do you have any thoughts or any advice for how, from your own experience, of how people may act or what they might do in order to cultivate greater trust and become more trustworthy, and to cultivate trust within their own communities?
Whoa. I mean, I think the work of building trust is essentially small scale. That you start off with relationships that you're committed to, and you stick with it over time. That's the basic thought.
I mean, maybe a willingness to take on tasks that are not just the glorious ones or the attractive ones, but ones that need to be undertaken. Because partly you're showing, I think it's the point about sharing a life again. If you can show that you are a person who's committed to something other than yourself and your own greater glory, then that's being someone in whom trust is understandably reposed, because you've proven yourself over time to have a commitment to the good of others in a way that they can bank on, even if subject to verification and so on.
And I think forgiveness is a real challenge for us culturally right now. So we're all going to make mistakes. We do make mistakes. How do we deal with those mistakes that we've made? There's a real danger that you make an error, bang, that's it. And if we're individually people who are into restoration and forgiveness in our relationships, I think that has a transformative effect.
Partly it makes it hard, doesn't it, to speak the truth as you see it. If the truth as you see it and as articulated is going to result in a massive lifelong social penalty, then the understandable and maybe rational response is to obscure, dissimulate. Coping strategies that people had in Eastern Europe, to go back to your point before, Tom, not great for living well, I think, when you've got to guard yourself very carefully and not just be judicious and discreet, but really watch out for hostile attack. And it's hard, and I mean, many people have had to live well under those circumstances. But that's sort of about as problematic a context to develop personal integrity as you could imagine, I think. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe this is, it's a great proving ground for the development of integrity, but certainly looking at it, it seems hard.
It's not a great way to live.
No. I think there are some great reflections arising out of the experience of living under totalitarian rule. They're instructive, but God willing, none of us will have to undergo them.
All right, well, Tom and Richard, thank you so much for joining us for the Maxim Institute podcast this month. It's been a real pleasure to talk with both of you. And thank you for your time.
You're very welcome.
It's been a massive pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for this month's podcast. If you'd like to hear more from Maxim Institute and the rest of our work, head to maxim.org.nz, where you can also sign up for our Forum monthly e-news, and you can also sign up for event invitations so you can make sure that you don't miss out on Tom Simpson's 2021 Sir John Graham Lecture. From me and all the rest of the Maxim Institute team, goodbye for now. Mā te wā.